sort of facing at an angle? How do you want to do this? Or like
all right. Yep.
Angled. So we're kind of looking at each other, but outside the camera.
Yeah. No, I think we're good.
Actually, we're good with the way we are. Good. Okay.
All right, we're live. We're at day 2 of the Monero conference in Denver. A little rough this morning after quite the house party last night. How you feeling?
Well, I'm feeling actually awake because after the party, I got a lot of sleep. So I'm actually wide awake today.
Yeah, me too. It's kind of the best sleep I've gotten since I've been here.
Sound. Yeah, in good condition. Yes.
So yesterday you gave the last talk. Unfortunately, we had to leave a little early because we had to get ready for the party, but I know it was on spam mitigation in Monero and I guess in cryptocurrency in general, kind of making the comparisons between the coins and I guess how it's treated in each.
Yes, that is correct. I mean, I'm looking primarily when you are, how can you attack a chain? What are the risks? And some of the comparables in that, and what can be done in Monero. Monero is actually quite ahead of everybody else. I remember one of the comments saying everybody else is at 0 and we're at 1 out of 10, which is actually fairly accurate. And that's also very accurate in this field.
Why is it ahead? Is it just due to the architecture of Monero versus some of the other coins?
Well, a couple of things. I mean, the first reason is we actually have a scalable block size, which balances very nicely the need to actually scale the blockchain with the need to prevent spam attacks. And so we avoid things that what Bitcoin is having with a 1 megabyte block limit. They're actually been attacked, in fact, with a small block size. So we avoid that kind of thing. At the same time, I think there's been a lot of effort put into additional mitigation measures, in particular minimum fees. Now, recently, we added a second layer median at 50,000, 100,000 blocks to 50,000 to actually move the block size. So there's a really nice balance between the need to allow for growth in the blockchain, while at the same time also allowing for to prevent spam attacks or make them pricey and expensive. So that's the idea.
So that's really the balance you need to meet when you're kind of designing against spam attacks.
That is correct.
The trade-off. So what exactly are the trade-offs?
Well, I mean, to give you an example of an extreme situation, I mean, if we look at Bitcoin in 2010, I mean, the solution to spam was let's cap the block size at a megabyte. What's actually happened? Well, what's happened is that essentially Bitcoin can no longer be used effectively as a transactional currency. Fees are too high. And ironically, the approach that was taken actually makes it profitable to spam because of the size of the block is so small. There's certain circumstances that people can actually attack the chain to cause fees to go up, and that's cost effective to the spammer. So you have
the miner is almost incentivized to do so.
Oh, the miners are incentivized. Right. If you in the Bitcoin case, if you have like about one, let's say you have more of the hash rate than the free space in the blocks, you actually have an incentive to spam. There's actually an incentive there, and that's why we've seen these floods of spam attacks in Bitcoin. All of a sudden, you get this surge in transactions. I think it was 50,000, 200,000, 100,000 transactions at one point. This is exactly the reason. So it's actually profitable to do that. There's an incentive. And one of the key things about it is to recognizing spam in any coin is there an incentive? For example, if I go back to Monero, one of the major concerns that there was recently is this Big Bang attack. But in reality, that in itself isn't the biggest data. But once you incentivize it, for example, with the possibility of another attack, like you're going to anonymize or something like that, then all of a sudden, even if that attack is being mitigated, at least it's an incentive for that. And that's the key in understanding. So coins are being attacked if there's a motive. And that motive has to be there. And typically it's financial, maybe sometimes some types of attack. It was to exploit a vulnerability. That can happen. I mean, that happened in Monero in 2014. I mean, someone discovered a vulnerability. You needed to increase the block size to a certain size. And then you turn around and say, okay, to exploit this. And then they spammed it in order to cause it to get to so they could do the exploited vulnerability. And the whole thing was patched like 5 years ago. But my point is, it was one of the reasons that got Monero initially to put in a minimum transaction fee, which is enforced by the nodes. It's a minimum relay fee is what it is, essentially. Like a node won't relay a transaction unless it meets this minimum fee. And interestingly, some other coins have done the same thing. Litecoin has done that. Bitcoin Cash has done that. And Bitcoin
who handles spam really well? Is there any?
Honestly, if I was going to say who actually is the best at it, it's Monero. And hands down, I mean, we are ahead of everybody else.
So are there going to be upcoming changes in how that's done? Is this a continuously evolving process?
Well, anything in Monero at this point is continuously evolving. So if a threat is identified, a potential threat is identified, then what's going to happen is the community is going to respond, and we're going to look at things. I mean, one of the things that people are talking about right now in a lot of the talks is to increase the mixing. I mean, this came out of Brandon's talk, as a recommendation. I mentioned that. It's a good way to mitigate against certain attacks, especially if we worry about de-anonymization or attacks that try to de-anonymize the mixings. So that's a common example of something that will be done. Can you tweak fees? Probably, very likely. So I think there is an evolving situation to optimize. We're ahead of the game, but we have a way to go.
Do some people kind of not believe in? I mean, how do you define spam, right? So it's a network that's being used. So I think some people almost say spam. There's no such thing as spam, right? It's if you're using the network and you want to use it, then there's obviously some use to you using it.
Well, that's a good question. How do you define it? And in a privacy coin where you don't even detect it, that's even more interesting. It's a very interesting question. One can look at what the intent is. It's malicious in some way to try to prevent other people or frustrate other people from using the network, or take away features that are desirable in the network. That could be seen. It could be seen as something adversarial. I mean, I guess if you think of email, when you encrypt everything, we have a rough idea what spam is in email. Mm-hmm. Now, just encrypt everything. Well, you still have the same definition. I mean, that could be a way to look at it.
So in Monero or Bitcoin, spam would kind of be anything where you're not using it for purposes of actually making transactions, or like, how would you?
Well, I mean, that would be one definition, and the definition is trying to exploit or attack the coin in a way. For example, try to prevent people from using it, or try to exploit a vulnerability. Those can be considered a spam. I mean, for example, a good example a good example will be what was done in Monero in 2014, where it was done to exploit a vulnerability. Another example I would say was happening in Bitcoin, where people see it attracted to push spam into the network just to increase fees for everybody else. Mm-hmm. So the intent of the transactions is not to transact in a particular way. It is actually to increase fees. Now, I wouldn't, strictly speaking, call something I say counterparty on Bitcoin spam. That's not. They're trying to do something constructive, and they're using Bitcoin to do that. But when you say, for example, where you're sending transactions on the Bitcoin network with the purpose of causing everybody to pay more money, well, that will be a reasonable definition. But it's a tough one. I mean, it's a gray area in some cases. Mm-hmm. It's not as simple as it sounds. It was a good question.
Yeah. So what else are you working on? Obviously, you're kind of the guru in the space in terms of looking at analyzing the chain for things like spam and how it should be, what the architecture should be to fight against it. What are some of the other things you think about when you're looking at Monero?
Well, when I look at Monero, primarily what I work on is scaling aspects. So that's fees, block size, changes in block size. How do we optimize that? That's been the area I've focused on from the point of view of recommendations for the actual coin. Of course, the other side of my involvement in the Monero project is being a member of the core team, which actually has nothing to do with this, because it's a non-core team function. To do that, there are members of the core team that do different things outside of their role in the core team.
What's a non-core team function?
Pretty well anything outside of the stewardship aspect of the core team.
Okay.
So if you're doing interviews, for example, a good example would be what Ricardo Fluffy Pony does. I mean, he does the maintainer on the code and so on. That kind of role is not a core team role. But the people that do coding, Luigi does a lot of coding, for example. This kind of thing is not actually a core team role. So the core team has sort of very specific responsibilities as far as stewardship, primarily, of the project. That's primarily what we do, and this is totally separate from the other. So it's important to make that distinction, because anybody could be doing this. A lot of people are contributing in all sorts of ways. It's not necessarily a function of the core team.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, so it's important to make that distinction.
Yeah, can you explain that a little further? So, then what is the function of the stewards?
Well, for example, there's certain things that you have to sort of keep on the stewardship. A good example would be things like domain names, websites, we're a decentralized cryptocurrency, but we are interacting in some respects with the centralized world, and there's certain things that you have to sort of bridge in there, and that'll be a good example of what the core team does.
So dynamic block size in particular, I always found that to be kind of an interesting and unique part of Monero. Have we seen that in action yet? Is it being used? Is it dynamically functioning yet, or is it kind of static in its use? Have you actually seen the dynamic block size work as intended?
Oh yes, I mean there were two examples. I mean the first example was right in 2014 when the coin was found, and we saw the whole thing work to design. It's happened. We went to 400,000 bytes. It worked exactly as designed, and it had that nice feature that. And then the blocks grow. The latest implementation, maybe a while before that's tested, because you basically have to go up to 15 megabytes to put it to the test. So that's going to take some time. I would expect that the long-term medians change would occur once, again, you need a certain amount of time, and the blocks have to be over 300,000 for basically 50,000 blocks. And then you see a change in the long-term median. But definitely we've seen that operational.
How's Monero use today in terms of usage, and what do the statistics look like?
Do you mean as far as transaction rates? We're a bit lower than some of our competitors, to be honest. I mean, one of the reasons is that Monero has a totally different code base from Bitcoin, and I think it's harder for exchanges and for certain providers, e-commerce providers, to actually implement Monero. I mean, it's not as implementing something like, say, Bitcoin Cash, for example, where you just got the same code base essentially as Bitcoin, or Dash, for example, is another good example of that. And it's relatively easy to implement, especially if you don't implement any. If you've got a coin such as Dash or Zcash, you don't implement any of the privacy features, which most exchanges, for example, and payment processors don't do. Then you have something that basically behaves like Bitcoin. So from a creating infrastructure, that's been a bit of a hurdle for us, in the sense that you have to look at the fact that if somebody's implementing on Monero, they have to really it's a new code base for them. So there is a bit of a it's been a bit of a hurdle for us. It's not as what it was, like, say, 2 to 3 years, of course. I mean, it's a lot more knowledge of it. But yeah, I would say that's an answer. So proportionally, the amount of transaction level they actually get compared to comparable coins, we're actually a bit behind in that respect.
So how about not compared to other coins, but just Monero itself in terms of the life of Monero? I mean, are we on a trend up? Has there been a dip down?
Well, we've been on a trend up fundamentally. Much from the Bitcoin. In some ways, I think the market tends not to follow exactly. It kind of decides on its own point when it's going to say that Monero has done what it thinks it needs to do. I mean, a good example is 2016, a historical example. There was phenomenal work done by Howard True on the database, and this was finally put into the main code chain. Everybody was using it in the community, but it was actually went into the sort of the release tags right on New Year's Eve in 2015. And it was done totally quietly. It's classic. And then what happened in 2016 is the prices skyrocketed, both in respect to Bitcoin and with respect to USD. So, but the work had already been happening like a year and a half ago in the process that led to this. So it's a bit of a delay, I think, and us doing improvements, and suddenly the market decided to do something about it.
Yeah, that's one of the, I guess, final question I want to ask you. I normally don't even ask this question, but in terms of price, more so, why do you think Monero, at least it's my opinion, that there doesn't really seem to be a clear match between Monero's abilities and versus how the market is seeing it? I mean, it's what, I don't even know where it is in coin market cap. It's like maybe 10 or 11. I don't even know. But why isn't it number 2? Why isn't it number 3? Where's the mismatch there between reality when you look at these technologies and the fact that Monero actually is digital cash and it's kind of fulfilling these goals? Why isn't the market realizing that? Markets
are not as efficient as people think they are. That would be my opinion on that one. We're actually 13th in coin market cap right now. And I think the main reason is a question of efficiency of the market. The market doesn't necessarily see what's happening behind the scenes until it actually comes on, becomes knowledgeable. That's common in very lots of assets. It's called the efficient market theory. Well, technical traders will look at assume efficiency in the market. Fundamental traders or investors, they will take the point of view the market is inefficient, and so they'll look for inefficiencies and see that as an opportunity. And I just think that the answer to your question is the market is just not efficient.
Mm-hmm.
Is that very?
Yeah, simple. I mean, Monero in particular though seems to have a big imbalance. Maybe it's just because of also the pure open source nature of it. There's so it's more difficult for that information to get out there. There's no like marketing arm. There's no.
Well, this is actually very true. I mean, we don't really put a lot of effort into marketing. The approach that's worked for Monero and worked in the past is let's make the coin better. That's what we put about resources into it. We're not into, and I don't want to mention the coin, but I mean, this is stories of one coin where they had a conference and they had a booth at the conference and they hired a hooker to stand there at the booth, and the conference organizers told them to take this away. I mean, this kind of stuff. Well, in the short term, you're gonna get some results. In the long term, no.
Right. So the cream will slowly rise to the top.
Exactly.
I guess so. One final question. So we're here in Denver. It's the first Monero conference. Mm-hmm. You've been in this space or in Monero from the beginning. We can say, how do you feel about Monero today and its growth and where we're at?
Well, it's actually
in terms of the community, and
it's actually scary. I mean, if you look at, say, the market opinion, you have 1,000 times. It went from a coin with a market cap of about 1.4 million to about 1.9 billion. In a period of 4 years, we've seen a massive growth in the community. We've seen phenomenal improvements in the code base that people don't even realize. I mean, when we inherited essentially the folk from Bitcoin, there's just so much work, so much improvement. It's a totally different coin from what it was in 2014. I mean, and I mean, at one point in Monero, just to give you an example, and going back to you needed like 9 gigabytes of RAM used to store the blockchain because the whole blockchain had to be stored in RAM. I mean, that was fixed in 2050. People that, you needed like if you did this today, you wouldn't be able, you need a computer with about 70, 60 gigs of RAM. Well, of course, so, I mean, these kind of things. I mean, we look at ring confidential transactions. We look at the increase in the mixing. We look at all the refinements that have been done with block size. We look at it on and on and on. I mean, and so there's so many improvements, and yet, you sort of, it's kind of an evolutionary kind of thing. So yeah, the changes have been phenomenal. This conference, of course, has been really good because you got a lot of very good speakers. I learned a lot. I got a lot of ideas. A lot of people got a lot of ideas, and then can be put back into improving the coin and into development. It's a great networking opportunity. You meet with people that you interact with them online, but it's very good to have a person-to-person interaction with somebody, and that's really powerful. Yeah. So this is like a major milestone for Monero. Yes, it is, absolutely, but a major milestone on a host of other major milestones.
And I think, like we were saying, and here, right, you don't hear anybody talking about price. Everybody's just talking about the technology, and it's pretty amazing considering this is a conference. If you go to any of these other crypto conferences, it's like 80% about the price and things like that. Here, it's really just focusing on the tech. A lot of it's even self-skeptical, right? So when a lot of the talks were even kind of looking at Monero in a critical way, right? To try to figure out what our shortcomings are and things like that, which you don't really see in other communities.
Well, that's very critical because that's how you improve. I mean, you have to identify the problems. You have to identify breaking Monero. You have to look at, okay, is this attack viable? What is the risk? What are you going to do about it? How can we make it better? And that's really what it's about. And you worry about the price later. Let the market sort that out.
All right. Thank you, Articmine. That was awesome. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you.